Hey guys, so it's unit 4 and it's time to talk about dirt. Okay, so we're going to go all through the process of learning about soil, how it's formed, what its characteristics are, and pretty much everything you could ever imagine knowing about soil. So let's go ahead and jump into our um, PowerPoint here. Maybe, there we go. Okay, so as I said, all about soil, also known as dirt. So first we're going to talk about the process of formation of soil. And so it's important to understand that soil is formed through a couple of different weathering processes. So the first weathering process that we're going to talk about is physical weathering. And in physical weathering, this is the mechanical breakdown of rocks and minerals. It's mostly caused by water and wind. So when water gets into the cracks in a rock and it freezes, it expands, that widens the crack. It thaws, more water comes in, and the process repeats until eventually the rock splits. We also have physical weathering through wind and through changes in the water around it. We also have biotic causes of weathering. And so those are things like the roots of plants pushing their way down into those cracks and forcing those cracks wider open, but also burrowing animals. So physical weathering increases the surface area of the rock, and that increased surface area of the rock can then lead to chemical weathering. And chemical weathering releases those nutrients that we talked about in our nutrient cycle, particularly phosphorus, from the rocks. And it's an incredibly important part of the phosphorus cycle. So there's also human-caused chemical weathering, as opposed to the natural chemical weathering that comes from our atmosphere. As humans burn fossil fuel, that releases sulfur and nitrogen oxides, which react with water vapor to form either sulfuric acid or nitric acid. And that results in acid rain or other forms of acid precipitation, which we'll talk more about when we talk about air pollution. So what are the effects of acid rain that are relevant to us right now? Well, it accelerates the weathering of rock. We have this picture here of a statue taken about 60 years apart, and that's due to acid rain, which is causing that rock to weather. This also happens with natural rocks, not just with statues. It also acidifies soils and trees, and it leads to the leaching of nutrients from the soil, making those soils less productive. So, but acid rain can also accelerate chemical weathering, which can be a good thing in some cases. So how does soil develop? So there are 3 stages of the development of soil. From below, first, we break down the rocks, and that gives us our raw material for soil. That's usually done by those pioneer species and by other forms of physical weathering. From above, we have that deposition of organic material from dead organisms. This probably seems familiar to you from our conversations about primary succession. And we know that those pioneer species, when they die, add organic material to the soil. So our young soil is going to have less of the organic material, and older soil will have more organic material. Young soil does not have good, well-defined horizons. It's usually not as weathered, meaning that its particles aren't as fine, and it's a thin layer. When we have older soil, it has well-defined horizons. We're going to talk about these horizons, but you see how at the top here, this area is very black. That's what we would call the humus or the O layer. Then we have our first layer, our A layer, which is our topsoil. Below that, we have a B layer, maybe a little bit of an E layer here, as well as a C, and we'll talk about all of those. But this is a very thick layer of soil. You'll notice in this picture, you're actually seeing the rock. Here, you can't even see the bedrock. So mature soil has more organic material mixed into it, and therefore it has more nutrients. But some very old soils, especially if things have been growing in them for a long time, might be nutrient poor due to plants and water leaching nutrients. So let's take a look at these soil horizons. So the O horizon is that one I was telling you about, the organic layer, and we're going to go through each of these. So 5 layers here of soil on top of the rock. So our first layer is the O layer. This is the organic layer. This is decomposed organic material. It is sometimes called humus, particularly this lower part of the organic layer. And we see the most pronounced O horizon in forests. Below the O horizon, we have the A horizon, which is the topsoil, what we think of as surface soil. This is organic material, mixed with mineral material. This area has the highest level of biological activity, whether we're talking about nitrogen fixing bacteria, worms, other detritivores. This is the highest level in this area. In the E horizon, not all soils have an E horizon, but if they have an E horizon, it comes after the A horizon and above the B horizon. This is most common in acidic soils. And in this horizon, this area of the soil, the metals and the nutrients have been leached out from above. Excuse me. Below that E horizon, and you notice in this picture, we don't even have an E horizon. We have the B horizon. This is the subsoil. This is mostly broken down rock from below. It does not have a lot of organic material, but it does allow roots to penetrate it. And so this is where metals and nutrients are. So, and then C horizon is basically just broken up rock. This is most similar to the parent material. It's just smaller pieces. So here we have the surface, maybe a little bit of an O layer, A horizon, B horizon, and C horizon. So you notice that not every soil sample is going to have all of those 5 layers. And just one more time, here's our image of our layers. Okay, so how is this different in different biomes? Because soil is very different in the different biomes. As we said, in the forest, this is where we have the thickest O layer. And you notice that the temperate deciduous forest looks different from the coniferous forest. The coniferous forest has much more acidic soil. It tends to have a higher level of iron and aluminum as well. The deciduous forest, because it drops its leaves once a year, does have generally a thicker layer of that O horizon. It has a heavy mixture of humus and minerals. It tends to have a silty, loamy soil. And underneath that, you'll have a clay soil and then your parent material. So very similar in that they both have thick organic layers and heavy A and B layers as well. Grassland soil is our richest soil, very rich in humus. Does not tend to have a very thick B layer. It has a very heavy A layer, a very heavy topsoil layer. Both the tropical rainforest and the desert have very thin A horizons, which might surprise you about the tropical rainforest. But the reason that that A layer is so thin is that the tropical rainforest grows so fast and everything decomposes so fast because of the heat that it actually has a very thin organic layer. And desert soil has the thinnest layer of all. Okay, so soil provides a lot of ecosystem services, from growing plants. Obviously, kind of its number one ecosystem service is to provide an area for plants to grow. It also assists with the cycling of nutrients. Most of the nutrient cycle for nitrogen occurs in the soil, as well as the phosphate cycle. It provides a habitat for lots of different insects and burrowing animals. It is our engineering medium, the thing we build upon. And it also helps with water filtration and then eventually in aquifers in water storage. So lots of services provided. Now let's talk a little bit about the properties of soil. So these are determined by the parent material. What kind of rock is it made from? They're determined by climate because that's going to change the biome. They're determined by topography, so how hilly or flat an area is, by what organisms live there, and of course by time. It takes about 100 years to make topsoil. So the process of soil formation is very slow. Let's talk about parent material. Here in the Atlantic coast, a lot of our parent material is quartz, which means that we have nutrient poor soil. Where we live here in Tidewater, that's not the case because we are a coastal floodplain, and so we actually have very nutrient rich soil, but much of the North Atlantic coast is a nutrient poor quartz parent material. Calcium carbonate, or what we have when we have sedimentary rock, tends to have high calcium, a high pH, and therefore it has high agricultural productivity. So a calcium carbonate parent material, a sedimentary rock parent material, is a much more productive soil. Okay, climate matters as well. If it is too cold, like in the permafrost, our organic material can't decompose, and so that results in a poor soil. And in the really humid tropics, the rapid weathering, the leaching of those nutrients, and the fast decomposition actually results in relatively poor soils there as well. So the happy medium for soil is somewhere in between, not the humid tropics, but in the temperate zones. Okay, so topography obviously is going to have a significant impact as well. Up near the top of a hill, if it's well drained, that's going to increase the quality of the soil. Down at the base, we're going to have much higher erosion, and the soil is going to be much less deep, and therefore it's going to be less productive soil. All right, and then obviously the things that live in the soil make a huge difference. So we have pictures of all these different little detritivores and nitrogen fixing bacteria down here. Plants obviously are going to take nutrients from the soil. They may also excrete acid, which will help to break down rock, which increases the soil. And when they decompose, they actually add organic material back to the soil. These tunneling and burrowing animals that live in the soil tend to increase the ability of the soil to take up water, but also to hold oxygen for plant roots. And so they tend to increase the productivity of soil. And then, of course, all of our organisms are going to participate in the cycling of nutrients. Obviously, our decomposers, our fungi and bacteria, are going to be particularly important in that part of the cycle. And then humans, we have a significant impact, whether it's because we're taking topsoil away, we're compacting topsoil with our agricultural practices, causing erosion by removing trees, we have a huge impact on the quality of soil. And then our last factor that affects soil quality is time. Soil just takes a long time to compose. So for starting in our primary succession, starting at bare rock, it takes about 100 years to go from bare rock to a nice, thick, developed soil that is capable of supporting thick vegetation. So what are some of the ways that we impact these cycles? As humans, when we plow and remove topsoil, that increases erosion. So when we reach the agricultural section, we're going to talk about the idea of no-till farming, which allows that erosion to be decreased. Other things that we do when we drive these big tractors or our cars over soil, it compacts the soil, which makes it less able to hold moisture. And of course, when we remove vegetation, that increases erosion. And as we increase erosion, that's going to make it harder for plants to take root, which is going to increase erosion and cause more vegetation to die. And so we get stuck in this positive feedback loop that is ever increasing. Another way that we impact soil is through agriculture. Repeatedly farming, particularly the same crop in an area, will eventually lead to a depletion of soil nutrients, which have to be replaced either with synthetic fertilizers or with natural fertilizers. So the last one that we have is pesticides. This isn't going to impact the fertility of the soil so much as it just impacts the amount of chemicals stored in the soil. Okay, so let's talk about the physical properties of soil. We generally talk about 3 different types of particles that make up soil, and those are sand, silt, and clay. Sand is by far the largest particle. Silt is the medium-sized particle, and clay is the very smallest particle. Now, those characteristics impact the permeability of the soil, the ability of water to soak into the soil. So sand is much more permeable with the larger particles, water can squeeze in between. Silt has sort of a medium permeability, and as you may know, clay is nearly impermeable. So this is why we line lots of landfills with clay, because it allows any leachate, any material that comes off of that solid waste to be captured inside that clay liner. So here's a picture of a landfill, and you can see that clay liner. Soils that have high levels of sand or that are very sandy soils have much greater risk of groundwater contamination because any chemicals are able to percolate through the soil. So let's talk just a little bit about our soil. Because we are in a floodplain, Tidewater has a nice mixture of these nice nutrient holding clays with the silt and sand that drain well. And so we have what is considered a fertile loam type of soil. So let's go back and take a look at this soil texture triangle. This triangle shows us percentages of silt, sand, and clay, the 3 dominant particle types. And it puts all of the soil types into this spectrum that has to do with the mixture of clay, silt, and sand. So the farther we get over here towards sand, the more permeable the material is going to get. And the farther we get over here towards clay, the less permeable the material is going to be. So here in loam is considered sort of the sweet spot for growing crops. But anything here in the middle where we have a mixture of sand, silt, and clay is going to be very productive and fertile soil. You want to have enough clay to hold some moisture in the soil, but you want to have enough sand that the soil can drain and not hold water against the roots, which causes them to rot and decay. Okay. So our best agricultural soil is a mixture of sand and silt and clay that we call loam. It balances water drainage with water retention. Okay, let's talk about some of the chemical properties of soil. So the number 1 is what we call cation exchange capacity, or CEC. So soils that have a high cation exchange capacity actually have kind of a negatively charged soil. These tend to be slightly acidic, and they are capable of holding on to a lot of the nutrients that plants need, because a lot of the nutrients that plants need have a slight positive charge, which means that they're attracted to that negatively charged soil. Clay tends to increase this cation exchange capacity, as does organic material. This is why we want some clay in our soil so that it can help to hold on to those nutrients, but not so much that it prevents it from draining well. Another important chemical characteristic of soil is what we call base saturation. And this is the proportion of bases to acids expressed as a percentage. Um, those bases are essential for nutrition, and the acids tend to be detrimental. And acids also contribute to leaching of nutrients from the soil. So there is a balance that needs to be achieved for base saturation. All right, last one or two. um, the last property of soil we need to talk about is its biological content. That's fungi, that's bacteria, that's protozoans. They make up 80 to 90% of the biota of soil. Then we get into the larger things like rodents, earthworms, snails, and slugs. These are all the detritivores, all the things that break down that organic material, and they also help to mix the soil. An important part of the bacteria in the soil is that nitrogen fixing bacteria. Okay, and you now have access to the soil food web, so you guys can create a food web for soil. Soil actually has lots of different levels of the food web, even going to the fifth trophic level and higher, because we are starting out at such a small level. So if you have any questions, as always, let me know, and I'll talk to you soon.